Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the seventh and final session of today's Keep Thriving Wellbeing Conference 2022. My name's Stephen Cook. I'm Head of Policy and Communications at the British Safety Council, and I'm chairing today's conference. Congratulations if you've made it this far from the beginning of the day, but do stay with us for what I'm sure will be a great final session. This time, Irfaan Arif is speaking about psychological safety and inclusion in the workplace. So I'm going to welcome Irfaan. Hi. Irfaan established his own behavioural science and inclusion consultancy, Develop Minds, in 2012, and has since worked with clients across all sectors, including finance, tech, film and TV, transport, health, legal and travel. And Irfaan has led the diversity and inclusion agenda for a range of organisations, including 2 large universities, helping them to address gender and ethnic diversity. So I'll say, Irfaan, take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Again, as Stephen's kind of already introduced, my name is Irfaan Arif. Again, my interests and my background is pretty much, working in this field of diversity and inclusion, and specifically from a kind of behavioural science and psychology perspective. And I guess the topics that we're going to discuss today: psychology, psychological safety, and inclusion. There's a massive linkage between the two, and actually between everything that's been discussed on some of the sessions today. So I've been listening in and out of the sessions as we've been going through them throughout the day, and there's a lot of commonality there, and hopefully when we finish by the end of the session we can get a bit more insight into actually how does inclusion link with wider organizational culture, how does that link with psychological safety within the organization. I want to start off with a question, so if we go to the next slide. And again, obviously you won't be able to kind of feedback on this, but I want you to just think, how quick, so when you meet someone for the first time, how quick do you think it takes our brain to make a decision about whether we, A, like someone or not, B, let's just say trust someone or not, and then C, find them competent or not, right? So have a think for a few seconds, how quick would you think we make that decision about somebody? And next screen. So, according to psychology, according to kind of research on first impressions, when I did my master's in psychology, I was looking at first impressions. And the research is it takes us around 30 to 40 milliseconds, right? So literally as soon as my camera came on today, your brain already categorized me into like, not like, trust, not trust, competent, not competent, right? And then now if I started off subconsciously, right, this is in the first 30 to 40 milliseconds, if I started off in your not like category or not trust category or not competent category, now it's my job to kind of convince you otherwise, right? So I'm going to try and kind of overcome those first impressions. Whereas if I'm in the other category of like, trust, competent, it's a little bit easier for me to continue, and hopefully you'll kind of be looking for the positives, right? You've already got a sense of, yeah, I like the sound of him, like the look of him, seems like he's a trustworthy guy or whatever. I might already have won you over a little bit with that first impression, right? And there's many reasons why, many different kind of influences in terms of what influences how you might put me into what category, right? So the brain doesn't change, the function of the brain doesn't change. We work this with it is as it is. We make these first impressions, count. The question is what influences my category, what influences your categories, right? And so we're going to focus a little bit on that during the first part of the session. But our map of the world generally is limited to our environment, our networks, and our influences. And sometimes if you think about it, I mean, you can think about Facebook, think about Twitter, think about social media, even work environment, work groups, right? So kind of cliques at work. What we often have is echo chambers, right? So, and echo chambers are basically environments where we are surrounded by people that are very much similar to us in thinking. And then we kind of feed information into that echo chamber, and we receive information that feeds into our map of the world, right? And so we don't necessarily always come outside of that, and we see the world in a particular way. And the question is, a lot of this thinking, a lot of the impacts of echo chambers, etc., also contributes to how we then engage with the wider world around us. Now, I'm going to talk about, when I talk about inclusion, I tend to think about it in kind of 3 different perspectives. So if we go to the next slide. Traditionally, when you think about diversity, when you think about inclusion, when you think about bias, you think about equity, equality, we tend to think about what I sometimes call interpersonal relationships, right? So from an organizational perspective, we have our equal opportunities policies in the past, or we've got the equality and diversity policies today, and they're very much there to govern behavior, right? So how does to make sure that person A does not discriminate against person B. And so that's generally what our perception about our understanding of this subject has been for quite a long time. And don't get me wrong, a lot of organizations are looking at it in a very different way, maybe looking at it more institutionally, more systemically, but majority still kind of have that focus on behavior. How do we change behavior? And actually, if you kind of reframe this whole conversation about inclusion a little bit, and let's look at it from three different perspectives. You can look at it from the perspective of design, you can look at it from the perspective of decision making, or you can look at it from the perspective of behavior. Right? So products in terms of design, in terms of how we design our world around us, our environment, our experiences. Thinking about when we design products, who are they safe for example. Decisions, how we hire, how we promote, how we assign responsibility, how we assign project leads, and so on and so forth. And then behavior, who we exclude or we include, right? Who we support, who we don't support, the everyday behaviors in the work environment. And the outcome from those three different perspectives is essentially whether someone feels a sense of inclusion, whether someone feels like they belong, whether it has an impact on performance, safety, but also well-being, right? So well-being is massively linked with this conversation on inclusion. So I want to share some examples with you. So if you just go to the next slide. So I want to think about a couple of examples from the perspective of bias in design, and how kind of our blind spots, if you will, can lead us to design our environment in a way that benefits one group of people compared to another, for example. So if you go to the next slide. So these examples are from a really good book, by the way, if you're interested to kind of follow up on this a little bit more. It's called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. And she gives lots and lots of examples. I've just picked a couple here. So she talks about, for example, crash test dummies. Right now, if I could engage with you, I'd ask you the question: well, what's the significance of crash test dummies? What's the link with equality, inclusion? So traditionally, when crash test dummies, when car manufacturers used crash test dummies, they had one for male kind of bodies and one for female bodies. The average weight and average height for a male crash test dummy was around 5'9" and around 70 to 80 kilograms. I think it might be wrong, kind of like 5'10", I can't remember, but it's around 5'9", 5'10". That's based on the average height of men, which is closer to the average height of men. The crash test dummy that was used for women was, and again I might be slightly wrong here, but I think I remember it was around 4'11", I think it was, and around 50 or 40 kilograms. It was really small, right? More like a 12-year-old girl rather than a kind of average weight and height and size of a woman. And what that led to is car manufacturers developing cars that are safer for men, right? Or people that on average height are taller, for example, and so forth. And so there was a couple of universities in the US that studied accidents by men and women, and similar accidents, right? So men and women experience similar types of accidents. Men were 70% more likely to survive an accident compared to women. And again, it's asking the question: how are we designing? Are we asking the question, who does this impact? Right? The example in the middle, that's to do with heart attacks. Some of you might have come across this kind of example before, but women were more likely to die from a heart attack until relatively recently compared to men. Right? And that's because symptoms traditionally are based on men. Right? The research is based on men, and so on and so forth. So the traditional symptoms, what sometimes called the Hollywood symptoms, you've got your tightness in your chest and shooting pain down your left arm, are traditionally based on men. And you'd have women who might experience palpitations, stomach pain, and would come into the doctors and would often be given tablets for anxiety or something, and so they'd often go and they'd be misdiagnosed, and they were more likely to die from a potential heart attack. Again, the question is around who's the world designed for, right? How are we doing our research? Whether that be in terms of medical research, whether that be other research in terms of our environment. Who are we considering? How are we doing impact assessments, for example? The final example I really like is to do with snow, right? And what the small town in Karlsgård, and what they found was that women on average were admitted into hospital at a higher rate than men. Now, the most popular answer when I ask the question is, why do you think that is shoes, right? Or dress, or all this kind of stereotypical kind of thought processes of, you know, what might men do, what women do. And so when the council were looking into these differences in admittances into hospital, what they found was that, so obviously they had to look at lots of data, and so they looked at patterns between men and women, or actually no, they looked at patterns of people who commute to work and people who would kind of take footpaths, do other things, and so on and so forth, public routes. And what they found was a higher proportion of men would take what they call a single chain journey from A to B, right? So they'd commute to work, they're more likely to drive to work. A higher proportion of women would take what they call a multiple chain journey, which is from A to B, B to C, C to A, and so on and forth. So they might drop kids off at work, at school, might go to the shopping, might do other activities, and they go to, and then on top of that, go to work as well. And they were more likely to use the public routes and the public footpaths and so forth. Now, the council traditionally would prioritise the commuter routes for clearing snow, for ploughing snow, right? And so those routes were generally safer, right? So people get to work and so forth, but whoever was using the public footpaths and public routes were more likely to slip, trip, fall, and so forth, and hurt themselves. And that could be both men and women, but on average, a higher proportion of women were doing that. Now, they said, okay, well, let's reprioritize how we clear snow, right? And so they might clear, so what they do is, okay, let's clear the snow of the public routes first, then we'll do the commuter routes if we have any resources left. Because it's clearly easier to drive through 3 inches of snow than it is to, for example, walk through 3 inches of snow, or push a buggy, or push a wheelchair, or whatever that might be in that sense. And the effect completely went, right? So that idea being that there's this disparity between men and women, right? And it's not necessarily to do with men or women in terms of, it's just more to do with the council initially, or the organisation in this particular case, not considering the different patterns that might exist within this environment, and what do we need to do then to make sure that we account for that, right? To make sure that we don't create a service or design something that has an adverse impact on one group of people compared to another. Next slide, please. So I just want to focus a quick jump now to bias in decision making. So I'm going to share a couple of examples with you, kind of always visual examples with you. So if we just go to the next slide. So when you have a look at this image, and this is one of my favorite kind of cognitive illusions. So it's not really a visual illusion, it's a cognitive illusion. Can you see that A and B are exactly the same color? So square A, square B are identical in terms of shades of gray. There's no difference between them. Now, I'm imagining lots of you kind of saying, no, they're not the same. They're different. And they look different, right? When I look at this image now, they look different to me. No matter how many times I've seen it, I still see A and B as different. However, as you know, what I'm probably going to say is that they're identical, right? A and B are exactly the same color, same shade of gray. So I'll give you some evidence. So if you go to the next slide. So all I've done is colored in everything else and just left A and B. Right, so now you should be able to see that A and B are exactly the same. This is the same image, it hasn't been changed. If we briefly go back to the previous slide, what about now? Right, so again, can you see them as the same, or do they still look different? Chances are, unless you look really carefully and really kind of focus, they will look different. Right. Now this is a really good example of how the brain makes sense of our world. Right. Obviously, this is linked to the visual kind of cortex and so on and so forth, but in terms of the principles around it, we generally expect, for example, with this image, we expect a chessboard or a checkerboard to be light squares, dark squares, light squares, dark squares, and so on and so forth, right? And so your brain generally, when it looks at this image, thinks square A must be darker, square B must be lighter, right? And so it creates this impression of what I expect to see. Right, so you have things like patterns. Your brain's constantly looking for patterns, constantly looking to meet expectations, and so on and so forth. So if you just go to the next slide, and then the slide after that as well. So what we get, if you apply this to our working environments, the way we shortlist and so forth, is we similarly, your brain makes shortcuts and looks to match expectations and so on and so forth when it comes to people and interpreting the rest of the world around us. So this was a study done where I think it was the government who had commissioned a research organization to send out do some work on names, and so they sent out around 10,000 CVs, I think it was, and 1,000 of those were with the name Alison Taylor, 1,000 of those with the name with Nazia Mahmood, and 1,000 with Mariam Namagembe. So similar CVs, but different names. Alison got a call back. I think it was 1 in every 7 applications, and Mariam and Nazia might be 1 in every 17 or 1 in every 19 applications. Right. So just the name being different had an impact on whether you were called back for an interview or not. Now, the question might be, what's driving that? Right? Is that conscious thing? Is it a subconscious, unconscious thing? And generally, we'd assume, given the amount that was sent out, this is more likely to be a subconscious thing than an unconscious thing. There may be elements of conscious bias there, obviously, but the triggers here, the name acts as a trigger, right? It acts as a trigger for example, so a particular name, Nazia, might trigger a religion. It might trigger a ethnic background, which then in turn might trigger a stereotype about that group of people, whether that's positive or negative, right? And so what happens is that might act as a trigger, and so we generally, your brain might nudge you away from that name for whatever reason. The other reason is around familiarity and similarity, right? So Alison Taylor might be a more familiar, easier name to pronounce, whereas Nazia Mahmood or Mariam Namagembe might be slightly different, right? Might be slightly more difficult. And the way our brain works, it's always looking to keep our life as easy as possible. It's trying to keep us in our comfort zones as much as possible, our echo chambers. And so what it does is, that's a little bit difficult for me to kind of expend calories on. So let me just nudge you slightly to the left and to the right. Now we don't notice this process going on, right? Because it is unconscious, but your brain's constantly nudging you very slightly from one direction to another and helping us make decisions. If we go to the next slide. This is a really interesting study that was done recently, and it's kind of really powerful as well in terms of society generally and the stereotypes that we have in society and how they can have an impact on decision making. Now, for those of you that don't follow football, apologies. For those of you that do follow football, you might find this really interesting as well. But there was a study done where researchers looked at commentators, right, and how they praised, the language they used to praise players. And whenever it came to, and the patterns that they found was, whenever it came to darker skin tone players, so black players mainly, players were generally described as being more physical, much more kind of link or description around their athletic abilities, pace and power, and so on and so forth. Whenever it was a praise about a white player, for example, it was much more to do with their intelligence, their game intelligence, harder working, and so on and so forth. Right? So this is a pattern that exists. Now, commentators aren't doing this on purpose, right? They're not sitting there thinking, right, okay, well, he's a black player, so I'm going to describe him more as physically capable, and he's a white player, and he's going to be more intelligent. This is the influence of years and years and years of conditioning, right? Because since the beginning of racism, for example, since the beginning of pseudoscience around categorizing human beings as inferior, different groups of people as inferior or superior, and that's filtered in through over time, over decades, over centuries. And what we see today is a bit of a legacy of that. We see a legacy of history where your brain absorbs these messages. We continually reinforce these messages in different ways about who is superior, who is inferior, who's intelligent, who's not, who's physically, athletically good, who's not, and so on and so forth. But that's how bias, how stereotypes, etc., can seep into the way we make decisions, the way we interpret our world, and so forth. If you go to the next slide. So thinking about design, thinking about decision making, what about behavior? Now, so if you go onto the next slide, behavior can come in many different ways, right? So there's one kind of way you can think of behavior in terms of micro behaviors, and so those are those everyday behaviors that we don't always think about, we don't always do on purpose. It's just normally a part of, or a pattern of our play, pattern of how we think and how we engage, and so on and so forth. So you might have something called micro inequities or micro affirmations. Micro inequities are the negative behaviors, if you want, so being interrupted regularly, being excluded from meetings or social events, for example, multitasking, consistently being asked to do more things than you're required to do, being ignored, right? Thinking about body language. Do I generally have open body language towards some people more than others, or closed body language? And also inappropriate questions, right? I might ask more inappropriate questions to some people than others. So these are your micro inequities. And the whole point of micro behaviors and bias is that these are consistent behaviors towards some people compared to others. Right? So when you think about impact, think about experiencing something on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and the impact that might have over time. It'll probably leave you exhausted. Right? Public recognition of the kind of, if you think about the kind of positive micro affirmations, is the kind of positive side of the micro behaviors, which is giving more recognition to some people, referral to the work of a person, invitations to meetings, gatherings, and so on and so forth, introductions, emphasizing the positive and also eliciting input. Right? The question to ask yourself is there pattern in my circle of friends, in my circle of people at work, for example, do I exhibit these behaviors to different people or different groups of people, for example, and who might they be? Right? So these are micro behaviors, and they can have a huge impact on a person's sense of belonging, sense of inclusion, and also sense of safety. Right? Now, next slide. So kind of swiftly moving on to psychological safety. Inclusion is at the core of psychological safety. So what we've just discussed is ultimately kind of almost the first stage of psychological safety. So just kind of onto the next slide. Before I define psychological safety, I just wanted to kind of highlight that the impact of psychological safety or the lack of belongingness, for example, is actually sometimes seen as more equivalent as actually can you just go the next slide, which is the animation, sorry, to click on the thing. So basically when Maslow was looking at the hierarchy of needs, his whole thinking was that, well, actually we've got the physiological needs at the bottom, right? And we've got everything comes after that. So we have our basic needs that need to be met first, and then everything that comes after that. And then we had someone called Margaret Mead at the time who was doing similar research, and she actually said, well, actually, hold on, I think belongingness is actually more important, or not more important, but is as important, in the sense that when a baby's born, the first thing you're looking for is that connection to your parents, or and you're straight away you're looking for that kind of comfort, that belongingness in that sense. Next slide, please. And research shows that being excluded from a group, for example, triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. Right? So think about that for a moment. I mean, when we think about inclusion, we think about exclusion, right? The long-term impact is ultimately well-being, right? Think about the impact on mental health. Think about the engagement within the organization and what that means. And so it all links nicely to kind of this idea of psychological safety. How do you create an environment where people feel included, but also take it further than that, people actually feel they can contribute to the organization? So if you go to psychological safety, as a next slide, sorry, as a definition, you could define psychological safety as an environment of rewarded vulnerability. Right? So this is some research done by a guy called Clark, I think it's Liam Clark, and he talks about the 4 stages of psychological safety, but he defines it as an environment of rewarded vulnerability. Next slide. And what he basically talks about is when vulnerability is punished, right? So think about what vulnerability is in a work environment, in an organizational setting. Right? Just reflect on that. When might you exhibit vulnerability, right? In your teams, thinking about the people around you, right? When vulnerability is punished, basically identity, social interaction, and performance become expensive. Right? So as soon as I expose myself in some way, right? I'm asking a question to a senior leader, for example, or I'm challenging a colleague on something, I'm showing a bit of vulnerability there, right? But as soon as if that isn't welcomed in any way, and that's punished either through negative feedback, either through being excluded the next time, then what I've done is that interaction is now expensive for me, right? Because it's had an impact on my identity, it's had an impact on that social interaction, but also my performance going forward. Next slide, please. So if you think about some of the questions that you might ask when you think about psychological safety, so just reflect on some of these questions. Have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you ever remained silent when you knew the answer to a problem, for example? Have you ever had someone steal credit for something that you did? So I won't go through all the questions, but just have a skim through those questions. And chances are we've all probably say yes to some of those questions, right? And think about what the impact was. What was the long-term impact? What was the short-term impact? It might be that you've only experienced this very limited way. It's not been that impactful. But then, some people might experience this on a daily basis for whatever reason. It might be linked to diversity, right? Who they are, identity, or it might just be linked to the work environment, the culture of the organization. Right? Next slide, please. So when we think about psychological safety, you can think about it in 4 ways, right? So you've got what we call inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And so it's important to understand that psychological safety is generally a function of two things, right? It's a function of respect and permission. So you can see there's respect on the vertical axis and permission on the horizontal axis, and it's the fusion or combination of these two things that produces a given level of psychological safety. Right? So psychological safety progresses through those 4 levels, 4 stages, and it's important to understand that the 4 stages represent kind of almost a universal human pattern that cuts across nations, cultures, and demographics. We all kind of go through these particular needs. The first stage is inclusion safety, which basically means that, actually, can we go to the next slide as well, please? So inclusion safety, which basically means that we feel included, accepted, we have a sense of belonging. And it's the first stage because this is probably one of the things that most people worry about when they interact with other people, right, in any kind of social setting. And according to Clark's search, for example, around 77% of people want to satisfy that very basic need to connect, right, before anything else. The second stage is learner safety, right? And there's a social exchange with all of these. The social exchange is, I'm giving something to the organization in return for something else, right? So from an inclusion perspective, I'm being human. It's in exchange for that status and absence of harm, right? When it comes to learner definition, I'm kind of encourage, I'm giving engagement to learn through encouragement to learn, right? And so learner safety is basically means that we can engage in all aspects of the learning process without being punished. And even if you're an expert, for example, who's coming to work on a new team, you still have to first learn about the culture and the context of the team before you contribute effectively, right? And then the third stage is contributor safety, right? That means that you feel free to be able to contribute as a full member of the team to make a difference, right? So I've gone through that process. I feel included, feel part of something. I feel like I belong. I've gone to that learner level where now I think, okay, well, I feel I'm included. Now I can develop, I can learn, and I feel comfortable to do that. I feel safe to do that. And then, okay, now I'm at a stage where I can start contributing a little bit more to the organization's goals, to the to the strategies or whatever that might be. Right? I can actually contribute my skills and my expertise towards that. And then the final stage is the what we call challenger safety. And this basically means that you can challenge the status quo without being punished, without retaliation, without retribution, or jeopardizing, for example, your personal standing or reputation within that team, within an organization. And challenger safety is the highest or kind of last stage, if you want, of psychological safety because it must protect the individual at his or her highest point of personal exposure and vulnerability. So you're at the most vulnerable moment there when you're challenging, right? And it requires the organization needs to protect you for you to exchange that challenge, right? Next slide, please. And so basically, we think about psychological safety, think about the impact of not having psychological safety. So if you look at the spiral at the bottom, you get groupthink, you get blame, the organization generally becomes much more risk averse, a lot more silence and shutdown, right? From an individual perspective, collectively as well, how we engage with each other. And as we increase that, we have more inspiration for openness, right? We have more trust, we have more curiosity, creative solutions, right? So reflect on that, on these things, and reflect on what culture do you have in your organization? What is it like? There may be elements, pockets, teams where psychological safety is super high. There may be elements where you feel actually, hold on, I can recognize some of these patterns in this particular team here, or maybe my team, right? And it's not just about being nice or trusting, right? But it's also about enhancing performance. So as an organization, as an individual, you might have very high standards, right? Your drive is super, and you really want to kind of make sure you perform at the highest level. But if you've got low psychological safety with this high drive, what that leads to is anxiety, right? Anxiety about your performance, anxiety about the environment, anxiety about how I engage with people, and that leads and carries on over into my performance, right? If I've got low psychological safety and I've got low generally the performance standards in the organization are low or whatever that might be, that leads to apathy, right? I don't do anything, right? And then kind of consequently, if you have low psychological, high psychological safety but low kind of performance standards, what that leads to is a comfortable environment, right? We can create comfort. And then finally, the kind of high psychological safety, high performance standards together combined lead to learning and high performance. And sometimes rather than pushing on performance, we need to think about that comfort levels. Where are people? Where are we currently as an organization? We've got people in anxiety, we've got people in apathy, we've got people in comfort zone, right? How do we take them to that learning zone collectively? Next slide, please. And so just kind of really quickly before we kind of finish, just a couple of patterns, a couple of things to look out for kind of psychological safety and what not to do. So these are things that you might see. I won't read through all of them, but just kind of have a quick skim through them. So blaming a person rather than a system or a process, right? This is a basic psychological thing. Attribution. Who do we attribute blame to? Do we blame it to an individual, or do we blame it to a situation or a process? So think about that. Always having answers rather than asking questions, for example. Having no team values or principles. Right? Do we have kind of basic standards, basic principles that we follow, that we all kind of sign up to almost? Let's go through some of these. Excessively sheltering the team, for example. Using toxic positivity to silence concerns. Right? So really kind of seeing negative emotions or experiences as a no-no. Right? So kind of saying, no, look, be positive. Always, don't worry about it. Keep positive. Carry on. So it's fine. Somebody experiences something really difficult at home. Yeah, be strong. Don't worry about it. You'll get through it. Right, that kind of toxic positivity where almost negative emotions we kind of almost outlaw them and say, well, don't think like that. Right? We have to give people space, right, to feel, to kind of really kind of experience grief if that's what it is. Tolerating poor behavior from team members. Again, if you tolerate something, it carries on. We never challenge it. It becomes part of our culture in that sense. So just be conscious of some of these behaviors and ask the question: do these exist? Where do they exist? Next slide, please. And kind of the opposite, if you want, is just to kind of get the basics right. Be inclusive in your decision making. Be conscious of decision making. Who is involved, right? Who do we ask questions of? Who do we bring in to make more inclusive decision making? Really define your team values and behaviors. Think about your communities of learning within your organization, right? Do we have a learning communities? Are we encouraging people to learn? Show vulnerability and emotion, right? As leaders, we need to show vulnerability for others to feel safe to kind of show vulnerability as well, right? And I guess whenever we model something, model behavior of some sort, right, we need to kind of create that environment where people can look up to us, look up to leaders, but also look up to each other in that sense. And also, again, this is something that doesn't happen overnight. Culture is something, it's like think about it as a big, large tanker that's going to take time to shift, especially if it needs changing. If you've got to take a little and often approach to it, right? So be patient. Next slide, sorry. So just kind of summarizing, really, I think it's just about really thinking about, what is your culture like? And ultimately, we're all cultural architects of our workplace, right? If we don't want the culture to change, what you're going to have is you're going to have patterns of thought, behavior, patterns of thoughts and behavior individually, as teams, as norms, as organizations. The question is, do we want to actively change certain norms? Do we want to actively change certain habits? And how might we do that? Right? How might we measure it in the first place? Right? So try to be this cultural architect where you are really thinking about the norms within the organization, those unwritten rules, right? What are they? Are they negative or are they positive? And how do we make sure we get the best norms and best rules to help staff feel their potential, feel included, feel like they belong, and to feel like they can really contribute and challenge the organization forward. Okay, final slide, I think it is, or second to last slide. Again, there's lots of ways to measure it. Find out more. Feel free to think about inclusion first as an index. You can ask lots of questions around that. Psychological safety measures, there's lots out there. But again, try to reframe how we think about these things, right? Go away from that model of interpersonal kind of inclusion or exclusion or whatever that might be. Think about it from the bigger picture, cultural perspective, systemic perspective. What are the things we need to consider in our organization, and how might we approach them? What might be the starting point? And the final slide, I think. Yeah, thank you. And any questions?
Well, thank you, Irfaan. I mean, really interesting stuff, actually. And I'm sure you've given everyone really good food for thought. In fact, someone has actually, rather than asking a question, they've just wanted to say what a fascinating session they found it. So obviously that's a sign that people have found it really good to listen to. But And actually, someone else has just said that they're reading Thinking Fast and Slow, I think it's called, by
Yeah,
Daniel Kahneman.
yeah,
So
yeah,
your opening made them think of that as well, about making assumptions about people and which bits of our brain are doing what, I guess, is the point
yeah.
around that. And you're obviously familiar with that as well. Uh, okay, so I mean, and I think you drew the link really interestingly between well-being and inclusion there, actually, and the cultural aspects. But just a couple of questions first. I mean, one that might be a bit of a devil's advocate, but
Sure.
are you ever worried that by asking some people to think of their behaviors as a microaggression, when to them it's just normal or a normal conversation, you might be reducing their psychological safety or maybe even damaging a group dynamic that works for them?
Yeah,
Might be
I
a
mean,
devil.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great question, actually. I mean, if you think about, so think about it from a diversity and inclusion perspective first. So we're doing some intervention on diversity and inclusion. We're maybe doing some training. Maybe thinking about culture within the organization. Going in there straight away and saying, right, okay, microaggressions, right? We need to think about our behaviors. I've noticed this about your behavior. You should do that, right? You should do that. You should behave that way. And that approach generally doesn't work. And if you think about with children, you tell people what to do, what not to do. It doesn't work. You have to create that environment first, where you say, right, okay, we want to have a conversation. Here are some observations that we have. There's no right. I mean, when I say everyone's experienced different things in their life, and sometimes when I do some training around this, I always start off with the question: name a time when you felt excluded, right? A time when you felt marginalized or you didn't fit in. And what that does is it allows everyone to think about it from their own perspective. But it also then allows us to listen to other people and say, yeah, I never thought that you might experience that. I never thought that you might experience that. And I think it's just a bit of empathy, but we need to create a safe space to have that kind of conversation. But it's a difficult conversation, and what difficult conversations do is they create discomfort. They create cognitive dissonance in our brains, and our brain tries to avoid it. And so we either go on the defensive or we completely avoid the conversation completely. As soon as you break down those barriers a little bit, and that makes the conversation a little bit easier. Yeah.
So this that might partly answer this next question that's coming. But
Yeah.
they want to know, how do you change negative norms though when they've been present within the
Yeah.
same group for a very long time, potentially many years? You know.
Yeah, and it's that's going back to my analogy of the ship, right? The big ship. It takes time for us to nudge it slightly. If I want to completely take a U-turn, it takes time, and I think it starts often. It has to start off at different levels. So you have to start off at leadership. Obviously, it needs that leadership, not just support, not just the lip service. I'll put it that way. It needs kind of real kind of embodiment of what these values and principles mean. People need to see leaders behaving that. And often when I speak to managers at that lower level, for example, or staff, one of the things I always hear is, well, what are the leaders doing about it, right? So there's that, and just really quickly, it's just maybe trying to approach it at different levels. So there's this model of oppression, right? And I'll really quickly, just before, I appreciate time finishing.
No, that's okay. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So this is model of oppression, and it basically says that there's 4 ways that you can look at discrimination or oppression. Now, as I said at the beginning, traditionally we see it as an interpersonal thing, but there's a level above that and 2 levels below that as well. The kind of overarching level is ideology, right? So what is the ideology or societal norms that we're constantly absorbing, right? So think about gender stereotypes for a moment. Women as a norm in society are expected to be soft, caring, nurturing, etc., etc. Men are expected to be strong, competitive, loud, and so on and so forth. And then we often have to we're often either put into those categories, or we end up being assessed based on those norms, right? So as a female leader, right, she comes in and she shows leadership skills, strength, confidence, etc., etc. But what she's doing, she's violating my norm that you're supposed to be soft. And so I assess her as being bossy, as being arrogant, and so on and so forth, right? So that's that kind of ideological level. Then you've got the institutional level, the systemic level, where it's the policies, the procedures, the way we design the workplace, for example. How much bias is built into that? How much of those norms are built into that? Then you've got the interpersonal level, where that's probably strongest at, which we can have the policies that you can't say this, you can't do that. This is zero tolerance approach to discrimination. Then you've got the final stage, which is that internalized stage. And that's, imagine somebody being told, I don't know, over a year, and even shorter, for example, that, oh, you're not worthy, or someone's excluded on a daily basis, or someone's not included into a meeting, for example, or someone's told that you're not very intelligent, whatever that might be, these negative things that you might, we're going to internalize that, we're going to stop believing it eventually, right? So one way to do it, going back to the question, is approach it at those different levels, right? So ask the question at systemic level. So systemically, first of all, what do we need to consider? What are the blind spots that we have? Think about it from interpersonal level. Think about those micro behaviors, microaggressions. We might need to do a little bit of awareness raising to start with, a bit of education before we go into a slightly more deeper level type of kind of behavior change. And then internalize. Ask the question, right? Do we think about the promotions processes, hiring, all of these things? Is there an element where staff don't come forward? Is there an element where staff feel like imposters within our own organization? Right? There's no simple answer to that, and I could go on and on and on, but it requires a multi-pronged approach. And I guess the best piece of advice I got once was that whenever you want to tackle something large and complex like culture change, is you need to take a little and often approach. Right? Sometimes we come in with big initiatives, big interventions, which have a bit of a spike, but then they don't continue sustainably. So yeah, little and often, absolutely.
Well, that's a great note to end it on. I think someone wants to know, have you written any books, Irfaan?
I've just actually written my first ever chapter in a book, right? And that's that's on mindset. So it's keep an eye out for it. It's Stephen. It's a guy, Stephen Frost, who's edited it, so it'll be out at some point soon.
Lovely.
But I haven't written that. No.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Irfaan. A really great way to end the day. So thank you.
Thank you.
And indeed, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed, thank you to all our speakers today, particularly Dr. Steve Foreman, who delivered our keynote address at such short notice as well, but also the many different organisations that have been involved in helping us explore the different facets of supporting and improving wellbeing in and outside of work. So, I mean, I hope you agree with me, they've each given us great insight into the breadth and range of issues involved. They've provided us with some really practical ideas and solutions as well that we can all take away and make use of in our own workplaces. I know some of you have already said you will be in the chat. I urge you though to jot down maybe at least one or two things you might do differently or suggest you could try out following today. But I really thank you all for joining us and staying with us, and I hope you found it as interesting and stimulating as I have. You will get a follow-up with the recorded sessions and any further resources that you might find helpful. But we'd love it if you'd complete a short survey. You will be taken to this once this session has ended, so do stay with us and tell us how you found it. But from me, thank you, and from everyone involved as well in the Keep Thriving Wellbeing Conference 2022, goodbye.